In many long-lasting series, you will eventually find remakes of older games in the franchise. Final Fantasy, Mega Man, Halo, Resident Evil, the list goes on and on. As of the writing of this video, Fire Emblem has a total of 17 games in the mainline series, 3 of which are remakes. Fire Emblem 11 is a remake of the first game, Fire Emblem 12 is a remake of the third, and number 15 is a remake of the second. So, when you're in the Fire Emblem community and discussing which game might get remade next, most eyes turn to the next entry sequentially in the series, Fire Emblem 4, Genealogy of the Holy War. Like every game up until the 7th, the Blazing Blade, this entry was never officially released outside of Japan. However, fan translations of the game do exist, and many of the characters do appear in Heroes and Engage. However, Genealogy is a very different and unique game, especially compared to the other entries in the series. This is both in regards to its story and its gameplay. Many people online have discussed their thoughts and opinions on how this game should be handled in a remake, as well as a potential remake of the 5th entry in the game series, Thracia 776, which is so tightly interwoven with this game. I won't be touching on that entry completely, but I will be making a few references as I discuss this one. While this game is bordering on 30 years old and you probably have had plenty of time to play it, this video will cover full spoilers, so if you want to go into the game blind, you might want to stop until you've played it yourself. But if you're already caught up, or if you don't care about the spoilers, then strap in as we discuss the most unique entry in the Fire Emblem franchise. Also, this is just going to be here as a preemptive apology for any names I may get wrong. For the most part, I'm going to be using the names on the wiki and the ones from Heroes rather than the ones in the fan translation, and I may mispronounce some of them. So this is just a preemptive apology if I mispronounce anything, and if you see anything that directly conflicts with the things you're seeing on screen. You know, some of the character names don't line up with what I'm going to say, but I'm going to be using their more official names rather than what's in the fan translation that I'm playing. So, before we get into the actual story and gameplay of this game, we first have to discuss the vast history of the continent it takes place on, as it is the easiest way to get across the story. Our story this time takes place on the continent of Jugdral, a continent that has already had civilization for centuries by the time the Arcanea, the setting of the first and third game, was just getting started. If you've played the Arcanea games, you may know that Naga, the leader of the Divine Dragons of Arcanea, foresaw that all the dragons who would stay as dragons would eventually succumb to madness, and the only way to prevent this was to become mannequins, dragons who took the form of humans and sealed away their dragon form into a stone. Some of the dragons didn't like this, however, and refused, not wanting to stoop so low as to take a human form, so of course a war broke out. The War of the Dragons would cause tons of problems on the Arcanean continent, but one of the most powerful rebels, a dragon known as Loptir, saw how the war against Naga was going and knew his tribe would be defeated. However, his hatred of humanity was not to be underestimated. So, when he met a man known as Gare, who was visiting from the faraway continent of Jugdral, he seized his chance. He created a blood pact that funneled his spirit and power into the most evil of dark tomes ever, becoming a dark dragon. This dark tome allowed Loptir to possess Gare, who returned to Jugdral to begin his reign of terror. Using the power of the Dark Dragon, Gare toppled the Republic of Gran, which had stood for over 400 years, and formed the Loptirian Empire as well as the Loptir Church for those who would worship the Dark God. Using the power of the Evil Dragon for the next 200 years and 17 emperors, all named Gare, the Loptirian Empire would do the most demented things imaginable to their citizens, killing tons of them and hunting children who would all be sacrificed to the Dark God. These guys were the evilest empire who ever eviled. Not everyone was on board, but unfortunately for them, no fighter could ever stand up to the might of the Dark Dragon's tome. Eventually, however, the 17th Emperor Gare's younger brother, a man named Meira, who was not possessed by the Dark God, chose to stand up against this oppression. Meira formed a rebellion to try to take down his brother, but it didn't really go very well. For a total of 21 years, he fought with the rebellion as best as he could, but Loptir's power remained unbroken, and they basically made no progress. This continued until the year 632, where the only 12 remaining leaders of the resistance were cornered in the desert. And just when all seemed lost, 12 dragons, with Naga at the helm, descended from the heavens, and much like Loptir had once done with the first Gare, formed blood pacts with the 12 leaders of the rebellion and granted them holy power and holy weapons. Unlike Loptir, using these weapons did not let the dragons possess them, but rather it allowed the 12 to use the power of the dragons. Using their newfound power, the 12 Crusaders were finally able to stand up against Geir the 17th, and by the year 648, the Emperor and the Empire were no more at last. The 12 Crusaders decided to begin reforming the world. With Mayer at the helm and 6 others at his side, they created the new Kingdom of Granavel. A pair of siblings would form the countries of Munster and Thracia, one would form the Kingdom of Salice, and another would form the Kingdom of Isaac, and the 12th would form the Kingdom of Augustria. Other kingdoms, such as Verdane, would pop up over time, and with this, a long era of peace began, and many would finally get to know peace from the Dark Empire. However, the Loptirian bloodline was not extinguished. Mayer may not have had the power of Loptir, but the blood lived on in him as Geir was his brother, and he warned his descendants that none of them must ever have more than one child, for a child who was born of a relationship between 2 of his descendants would be a vessel for Loptir again. The few remains of the Loptirian Church who were around would certainly aim to make that happen if they could. This finally takes us to the start of the game. Enter our protagonist, Sigurd. He's the son of the Duke of Chalfie, a man named Byron. Shortly before the game began, the Kingdom of Isaac attacked a Granavel fortress, massacring its residents. The people of Granavel weren't too happy about this, so the Prince of Granavel, a man named Kurth, leads their armies to figure out what the heck's going on. Accompanying him are Lord Byron of Chalfie and Lord Ling of Ljungby, a neighboring territory to Chalfie. Granavel's on pretty friendly terms with Isaac for quite a while, so they want to know why this sudden attack happened out of the blue. So, while his father is off escorting the prince, Sigurd is left in charge of Chalfie to hold down the fort until his father comes home. While Sigurd isn't expecting any trouble, the neighboring kingdom of Verdane has other plans as they unexpectedly invade the territory of Ljungby while all their knights are away. The crown prince of Verdane kidnaps the daughter of Lord Ling, the woman named Edain. They start to turn their sights on Chalfie, and Sigurd decides that he can't just sit there and do nothing. Unfortunately, like Ljungby, most of the knights are away with the prince, and there's only a few that have to stand up against the army. So all Sigurd has is himself and 3 knights, Noish, Alec, and Arden. These 4 heroes set out to save Ljungby and rescue Edain, having no idea that this one small border skirmish would lead to so much more. And that is the setup to Fire Emblem 4. I apologize about the long setup, but a lot of the lore is given to you in bits throughout the game, and is sometimes in completely missable village events that not everyone is going to see. That said, I do recommend trying to save as many of the villages as you can, not just for the money payout, but also because many of the villages can give hints or explanations about the gameplay mechanics or bits of lore that you may otherwise not know. Something unique about this entry is that there are only 12 chapters in this game, which is less than half of what the game usually has in this series. However, if you break down each chapter into the segments that would roughly equate to a chapter in a normal Fire Emblem game, you have around 40 or so in the game, roughly speaking. So this game still has enough content to be equivalent to the other games. I'll go more in depth on this later, but something you'll immediately see when you start up this game is that the maps of this game are utterly huge, far bigger than anything in the rest of the series, and unlike every other game in the series, you can and should use every unit in your army in every chapter. There are no chapters where unit restrictions exist, as your force is small but elite. You're encouraged to use everybody. The enemy forces will often spawn giant hordes to face off against you, though usually each individual enemy is not super dangerous. They have a lot of them, but they're not super strong. On the other hand, Sigurd and his friends are all very powerful, but there's not as many of them. So if anyone dies, that's not really a good thing. Your units matter a lot more in this game than they do in others, as there really aren't any replacements for each individual unit. Sigurd is definitely the most powerful character, and he's also the most powerful lord in the series. He can't really solo the game, but he comes as close as any lord could to soloing their game. This game would be the birthplace of many things, some of which are unique to this game, and others which would go on to be series staples. First thing it introduced is the weapon triangle. For the first 3 games, no weapon specifically had an advantage over the others in battle. However, starting in this game, that changes. I'm sure every Fire Emblem player knows it by heart now, so say it with me. Swords beat axes, axes beat lances, and lances beat swords. Another thing that began in this game is the idea of skills, both skills for a class and skills for individual units. This was the first game where they were introduced, and while they weren't in necessarily every game going forward, this is where it got its start. Something that's unique to this game is the way that arenas work. In most Fire Emblem games, you can just go in as many times as you want and grind to your heart's content until you decide to stop. In this game, however, each arena is unique to each chapter, having a set list of opponents and only those opponents. Additionally, if your unit falls in battle at the arena, they do not die. They can try as many times as they want again, but as long as they lose, they'll exit the castle with 1 HP, which is unlike every other game where the arena will kill your unit if they fail to win. The way gold works in this game is also unique. Unlike the other games where the army has a giant pool of gold that everyone shares, in this game each unit has their own little set of gold, and you can't really trade it between people unless they're lovers, or a thief can give their gold to somebody else but they can't take it from others. So that's a unique thing. Also, items are not able to be traded either. In this game, if you want to get items between two different characters, you have to have the first character who has it sell it to the pawn shop, and then the other unit has to come in and then buy it back from the pawn shop. Villages also can no longer be destroyed in one turn by bandits. In most Fire Emblem games, if a bandit gets there, then that's it, the village is gone. But in this game, it actually takes a total of 10 turns. Once a bandit gets there, they'll destroy these segments one by one, and this reduces the total gold that a unit can get when they rescue it. It starts off at 5,000 if you get to the village undamaged, but it's reduced by 500 every time the village takes damage. So you want to get there first so that you can make sure to get as much gold as possible for whatever unit needs it. Additionally, this is the first game to include a second generation of units. This mechanic was also in Fire Emblem Awakening and Fire Emblem Fates, but it had its start here, though it works pretty differently to those games, and I'll explain that more in detail later. Though we only start off with 4 units, we are joined by a total of 6 more throughout the chapter. After the first turn, we get Lex, who is the son of Duke Lombard of Dozil, and Azel, the younger brother of Arvis, the current Duke of Velthamir. Azel wanted to come help Adain, who he has a crush on, and Lex is really just here to support his best friend. On the second turn, we get Ethelyn, who is Sigurd's sister, as well as her husband Quan, the king of Leonster, the ruling house of the Munster district, and their loyal knight Finn. The archer knight Midir, the last knight of Ljungby, is also recruited when they take back the castle, and he was injured in a failed bid to protect Adain. Another unique thing to mention about this game is that in each chapter the player has a home castle. At the start of the very first chapter, Arden's left defending it, and in theory you're supposed to leave someone there to defend the castle in case an enemy unit reaches it, but in practice you don't really need to do that the majority of the time. You kinda want everyone on the front line, and you should be slaying every unit long before they can get in range of your home castle. However, should you let an enemy enter your home castle, that's another game over condition that the player can fall to, much like if Sigurd happens to die. Now earlier I mentioned how huge these games' maps are, and you might have wondered if there's an easy way to get around them for all of the units who are not on horseback, and the answer is not really. The only really easy way to get around it is through your cavalry units, but not all of your units are cavalry. There are the warp and return staffs that can warp you to certain castles, but that's not always ideal or even feasible in a chapter. And that's the biggest design flaw with this game. Your cavalry units are always going to be running circles around your infantry units, who will often fall behind in terms of stats simply because they're not getting enough EXP because they're falling behind. Of course, you can slow down your cavalry units for your infantry units, but that's going to make the chapters take even longer, and in this game the chapters are very, very long. And I think that if this game was to be remade, that's the biggest thing they need to address. They need to nerf the cavalry units and buff the infantry units, so that we're not expected to pretty much just use our cavalry units. It's not like you can't use the infantry units, but it's just going to be a slower experience overall, as they take much longer to cross maps and face off with enemies. Earlier I mentioned that this game has a romance system, but veterans of the series will know that the support mechanic was not introduced until the 6th entry. So how does it work in this game? Well, two units who are capable of love with each other just have to end their turn next to each other, and their support rank will grow with each other. Additionally, there are a number of events that can be triggered in each chapter that can increase the love rank between two different characters, or it may simply grow the units, stats of one of them, or it may gift an item to one of them. These are all useful things, but it doesn't really tell you what they're going to be. You just have to make sure you're paying attention at each point in the chapter, especially after you conquer a castle, to make sure that you can see when characters can talk to each other and figure out when certain events are going to trigger. You never really want to miss these unless you're trying to avoid certain characters pairing up with each other, so make sure to pay attention. But that said, this is just something that you may not pay attention to, as you wouldn't expect it to be there. You know, you expect if someone's going to talk to a different person, you know, if there's going to be an event, it's going to be there from the beginning of the chapter, and you wouldn't expect it to suddenly trigger after each castle that you conquer, but that is how it works, so make sure to pay attention. Honestly, I would just look up a guide of all of the different events that can trigger, and make sure you know which ones you want to trigger, because, well, they tell you exactly what's going to happen and what the result will be, and you want to make sure you're building your army and your romances in the way that you want. Anyway, I think that's enough with the game mechanics for now. Let's continue with the story. As they continue to fight through Jungvi territory and cross the border to Verdane, Arvis actually appears on the battlefield, confirming that Azel is with Sigurd, and telling Sigurd that he's now been promoted to Paladin of Granavel. He gifts him a silver sword, and encourages him to continue on the Verdane campaign, which Sigurd does. Using this new gift from the king, he cuts through the armies of Verdane, and establishes a foothold by capturing one of Verdane's castles on their border. Now using Evan's castle as a base, Sigurd and the gang decide that since Edane has been taken deeper into Verdane's territory, they really have no choice but to invade. After all, the king of Verdane, a man named Bantu, has been so peaceful up until now. Why would he have suddenly given the order for his sons to attack Granavel? Wait, a country that out of nowhere attacked Granavel despite previously being on good terms with them. That sounds familiar. Anywho, it turns out they actually didn't need to do anything because the youngest prince of Verdane, a man named Jamke, actually frees Edane since he doesn't agree with what his brothers and father are doing. Edane is escorted by a thief known as Du, who is also freed back to safety. Sigurd also ends up recruiting a woman named Ira, who is the princess of Izok, who was working with Verdane only because one of the princes locked her nephew and the true heir to the throne, a young boy named Shanann, in the dungeon. Jamke attempts to reason with his father, but the Dark Bishop Sandema is influencing him, and basically sends him back out to the front lines. Jamke temporarily fights our heroes, but Edane convinces him to work with them. As Sigurd travels throughout Verdane, he has a chance encounter with the most important character of our story, the titular Girl of the Spirit Forest, a woman named Deirdre. Some punk is bothering her, and Deirdre appreciates it when Sigurd helps her out of the situation. Sigurd seems to be immediately smitten, though Deirdre pretty quickly runs away. A local village elder warns Sigurd to forget his feelings for her, as Deirdre is apparently forbidden from marriage. Believing this to be some traditional nonsense, Sigurd is determined to meet her again. And while passing through the forest on the way to stop Sandema, Deirdre emerges to meet Sigurd again. He reaffirms his feelings to her, and she admits that she loves him too. After the end of the chapter, these two end up married. However, this is where this game, being a nearly 30-year-old game on the SNES, sort of comes in to limit it. See, the romance between Sigurd and Deirdre is not really well elaborated on. They just sort of meet, and they have like a total of 10 lines of dialogue throughout this part of the game, and somehow that's supposed to make you think that they've fallen in love with each other. It just doesn't really explain much, and it really doesn't help the fact that Fire Emblem maps are usually maps that take place over the course of a single battle in a single day. Fire Emblem 4 maps, however, encompass large parts or the entirety of a country, and the implication is that multiple days, if not weeks or potentially months, are passing during the events of these chapters. We don't know how long it was between Sigurd and Deirdre's first meeting in Marfa Castle and their second one in the Spirit Forest, and it's a little unclear how their relationship built. If you just go based off the game dialogue, it seems like they just thought each other was attractive and that was enough, but I assume there is more to it. And that's why I'd hope that in a potential remake of this game, we just get more, detail or just more depth on their relationship. For a game that seems to insist on how well this relationship went, I just feel like we know very little about it, and I wish that would be improved upon in a remake. One more thing to mention while we're on the topic, there are two pairings that are officially canon to Fire Emblem 4. Quan and Ethelyn, and Sigurd and Deirdre. Fire Emblem 5 confirms two more. Well, it confirms one and implies another. Sophie and Ced will always be the children of Aranis, and while their father can be anyone in genealogy, it's confirmed to be Elwyn in Thracia 776. Additionally, Lachesis is implied to have married Beowulf in this game. Why? Because Diarmid, who is Lachesis' son, can wield the Beow sword, which is his specialty sword. The only other person who can do that is Fergus, a man in Thracia 776 who claims to be Beowulf's illegitimate son. So, if he's the only one who can wield the Beow sword because he's his son, and Diarmid can wield it too, it implies that he is in fact the son of Beowulf. Another character to mention is Finn. He can technically marry any of the first generation women, but it's implied by Fire Emblem 5 that he did not marry any of them. His discussions with Evelyn in that game imply that he certainly didn't get involved with Brigid, and while some people seem to interpret his words in that game as if he is the father of Nana, not only would that break the Beowulf canon, but also I just don't think that that's the correct read. It's never directly said one way or the other, but my take of the implications is that he is not her father, but rather has essentially acted as such, as similarly as he has acted as a father towards Leif in that game. So that's kind of how I see it. I think that Finn didn't end up with anyone, but again, that's something that's more up to speculation. Anyway, after taking down Sandema, Sigurd finds the old King Bantu who is dying after Sandema attacked him. And after he dies, he's ordered to hold position in Verdane until further notice by the Granaville leadership. During this time, between chapters, he ends up marrying Deirdre as previously mentioned. Some months pass, and the lords of the northern country of Angustria begin gearing up for war, especially after the prince, a man named Chagall, murders his father under the direction of the Dark Bishop leading the Loptir Church, Manfroy. So, while Sigurd's good friend Eldigan of Nordian goes to try to convince the new king to stop this madness, Chagall decides to thank him by throwing him in prison for insubordination. The other lords of Angustria all begin attacking Sigurd, who has no choice but to respond. This chapter introduces us to several new units. First up is the arena fighter named Chulain, who joins you if you defeat all of the enemies in the arena, and is impressed with your strength. Next up is the Princess of Nordian and Eldigan's younger sister, a woman named Lachesis, who I mentioned previously. Past them, there is a bard named Elwyn, who is actually the Princess Celise in disguise, although we figure that out pretty quickly. There is also one of the enemy mercenaries, a man named Beowulf, who can be paid to join you. There's also a dancer named Sylvia, and a Pegasus knight named Aranis, who came from Celise looking for Elwyn, and is tricked by Chagall into thinking Sigurd has him captive. But once Elwyn talks to her, she joins the side, understanding that she had been tricked. During his conquest of Angustria, Sigurd learns some rather unfortunate news. Despite doing nothing of the sort, Duke Reptor of House Frege and Duke Lombard of House Dozel have begun spreading rumors that Sigurd is conspiring with Quan and Eldigan against the crown of Granaville. Why? Because those dukes hate Prince Kurth and Duke Byron. They seem to think that once Prince Kurth takes the throne, he'll get rid of them for being corrupt and evil. So they decide to prove him right by being corrupt and evil. Anyway, Sigurd doesn't really have a choice and has to keep fighting in Angustria. First to save Nordian, and then to save the villages that are being attacked by the Angustrian lords, and then just to try to make it all the way to the capital to try to reason with the new King Chagall. Later on into the Angustrian campaign, Sigurd also learns that Prince Kurth once had a long-lost love, a woman named Sijin who was the former Duchess of Velthamir, and Arvis's mother. The former Duke of Velthamir was a pretty horrible person who cheated on her constantly, one of those times resulting in Arvis's younger brother, Azel, the fire mage who joined us. But, because he was petty, once he found out about her affair with Prince Kurth, ended his own life, and then Sijin departed with grief. Kurth never really moved on, and Sijin hasn't really been seen since. The prince remains unmarried, and many wonder if his affair with Sijin resulted in another child, though nobody really knows if that's true. As Sigurd begins marching on the capital and Chagall panics, we learn some rather unfortunate news. Manfroy receives a visitor that tells him that Prince Kurth has been assassinated. We also learn that Arvis is a descendant of Mayra and is collaborating with Manfroy in their plot so that his lineage as being related to the Dark Evil Emperor is not exposed. Manfroy also mentions that they still need that woman's daughter, implying that Sijin did indeed have a second child, and we all know what that means. Anyway, after Sigurd defeats King Chagall, we learn that he survived the battle and that Eldigan has been freed. Eldigan and Sigurd talk, and Eldigan isn't very happy to see that his friend has basically invaded most of his country. Sigurd explains that he really had no choice but to fight back against the Augustrian lords, and begs Eldigan for 1 year to work with the Granavel leadership to resolve the issue. Eldigan reluctantly agrees, though he warns that any betrayal will result in Sigurd's demise. Before we continue the story, I do have to address the elephant in the room, and that is the map design of this game that I have alluded to a few times. It's very, very bad, and this chapter in particular is probably the worst. This game and the series at large generally encourages players to keep their army in one big group, or sometimes 2 or 3 chunks. But in this chapter, after conquering Anthony Castle, units spawn near Nordian from Macaulay, and you suddenly have Aranis' unit rushing down your home castle. So an unsuspecting player will capture the castle of Anthony and won't have any units in the correct position to deal with Macaulay or Aranis. And while you can use the return and warp staves to move some units back, you need most of them near Nordian to face off with Macaulay's army. And it just sucks that the optimal strategy for this chapter is to leave Sigurd in place at the doorstep of Anthony, and have the rest of the army spend 6 or 7 turns rushing down back to Nordian, and to then have Sigurd capture the castle so they'll be in place for when the Macaulay army spawns. And of course, you need at least a few people to go face off against Aranis' unit once they arrive as well. It's just kind of a stupid thing that an unsuspecting player will have no idea. They'll just immediately capture the castle, and then boom, suddenly there's just units there and you never really had any idea that you needed to reposition things. It's just not very fun because, again, you have to spend so many turns first getting your army to face off with Anthony and then getting them back so that they're in position to face off against Macaulay. There's just no real good way for this chapter to flow. It's not very fun, not very good, and yeah, this is just kind of how the entire game is. And this is definitely the worst chapter. Not very fun, and the map design of this game is just generally pretty bad with the flow that it expects you to follow. So, yeah, just wanted to get this out of the way before we move on with the story. So, 6 months pass, and Sigurd's attempts to reason with the capital of Granavel fall on deaf ears. No matter what he says, he's ordered to maintain position at Augustria's capital and do nothing. The forces not under Sigurd's control, controlling the rest of Augustria, begin abusing their power, and the people of the country aren't too happy. So, King Chagall sends his army to attack despite the fact that it's not been a year, and Sigurd has to fight them off. During this chapter, by the way, Deirdre is not allowed to fight, as she is taking care of her and Sigurd's young son, a boy named Sealith. Now, she's reluctant to let him go without her, as she has a feeling that if they're ever separated, they'll never meet again. Sigurd reassures her that this isn't the case, and she reluctantly stays behind. Anyway, after taking the first castle, Sigurd gets some visitors. A priest named Claude, who is the Duke of House Edda, and Duke Reptor's daughter, a woman named Tailtew. They arrive and finally tell Sigurd that Prince Kurth is dead, and that Dukes Reptor and Lombard are pinning the blame on him and Lord Byron of House Chalfie. Even though most of the people in Granavel know that those dukes hate the prince, they have sway over the courts and are turning everyone against the house. Sigurd wonders if they can trust Arvis, who was friendly to him previously, but Father Claude decides that this isn't really a good idea to rely on it. Tailtew says that she doesn't support her father, and she's basically just here to protect Claude. So the two of them go to the Tower of Bragi so that Claude can pray and learn what really happened to the prince. Later on, they'll join the army, as does the former captain of the Orgehill Pirates that Sigurd's army has to face off against, a woman named Brigid. Turns out she's actually Dane's long-lost twin sister who was lost at sea and rescued and raised by pirates. In this chapter, you can either kill Eldigan in battle, or you can have Lachesis talk with him. Regardless of what you do, however, the end result is the same. If Lachesis talks with him, he reluctantly agrees to return to King Chagall and try to convince him to stop the war. However, if he does this, Chagall does have him executed for treason, but at least Sigurd didn't have to fight his friend. Anyway, after defeating Chagall, Deirdre, back in home base, decides that she needs to rush to Sigurd's side, feeling that it's important for her to be with him. She leaves her newborn boy Sealith in the care of Shanann, but unfortunately immediately after she leaves, Manfroy shows up out of nowhere, attacks her, brainwashes her, and erases all of her memories, and reveals that she is Sidon's daughter, saying that she needs to be prepared for her true husband. Uh-oh, I think we know what that means. Anyway, Shanann soon rushes to Sigurd's side in tears and to inform him that Deirdre has gone missing, but he brings Sealith with him, who is thankfully safe. Unfortunately, the bad news just keeps on coming. As soon as the pirates of Orgahil had been subdued, the entire Granavel army shows up with Reptor at the helm to arrest Sigurd, as he's now officially been declared a traitor to Granavel. Reptor gloats as he knows that Lombard personally killed Prince Kurth and injured Byron, who managed to escape. We learn that unfortunately Arvis is working with them and convincing the old and senile king of Granavel that House Chalfie are the traitors. Thankfully, before all can go wrong, the Pegasus Knights of Salice appear and offer Sigurd refuge in their country until his name can be cleared in Granavel. When Chapter 4 starts, it's been more than a year since the end of Chapter 3, and Ethelyn, Quan, and Finn are all leaving to go back to Leonster. Quan, however, promises that he'll ride to Sigurd's aid with the might of Leonster as soon as he can. Sigurd also learns the good news that a daughter of Prince Kurth has been found, and that she and Lord Arvis are getting married. All seems well for the future of Granavel, which is good news for Sigurd as he doesn't want the bloodline of the royal family to die out. Unfortunately, he's still a traitor and he can't return home. An event with Claude actually tells us that he tried returning to Granavel, but Reptor intercepted Claude and declared him a traitor too, and so he was unable to tell the king of the truth of Reptor and Lombard's betrayal. So that's unfortunate. Anyway, I don't really have much to say about Chapter 4. It involves the Civil War of Salice and Elwyn dealing with his family troubles, but it really doesn't affect the grand plot of the story very much, so let's move on to the next chapter. Anyway, as we start Chapter 5, the gang now stands at Granavel's northern border, and as Granavel prepares to attack and apprehend them, Duke Byron, who is on death's door, manages to escape pursuit and reach Sigurd. He delivers to him the house's elite sword, Tyrfing, before he dies. During the many scenes at Valhalla during this chapter, we learn that indeed Deirdre was Kurth's daughter. Arvis found Deirdre outside the capital and had no knowledge of Manfroy's hand in putting her there. He fell in love with her immediately, and yes, she is his half-sister, though he never really knew she existed, so I guess it's not as bad as it could be. I find this chapter so fascinating with how all of the characters act. After conquering Lubeck Castle and slaying Duke Lombard, Sigurd sends Sealith and Shanann, as well as his squire Oyfi, away to Izok for safety because he doesn't want them to be involved in the war any further. After they leave, he says to himself that he hopes Sealith will grow up safe, implying that he won't be there. There are a number of events where the friends can all talk to each other, and they all seem to think this is their last battle. There's an unused event with Alec and Noish where they both express how fun their time together has been. In a conversation with Lex, Azel expresses his worry about phasing his brother, and Lex admits that he doesn't view his father's death as a tragedy, knowing how evil he was, though he admits he struggles to see Arvis as their enemy. Du and Jomke have a conversation where Du wonders why everyone is acting so weird when they're so close to winning, but then starts to act a little weird himself, saying that he really appreciates Jomke, who remarks that even Du can sense that something is off. In a unique event, if Claude and Edain ended up married, Claude will reveal that at the Tower of Bragi, he foresaw his own death in this battle, as well as the defeat of their entire army, which Edain struggles to accept. An ominous warning of things to come. After conquering Fëanora, most of the husbands will try to convince their wives to leave for safety, but they will all refuse, not wanting to abandon them. Ira will also make a personal statement that she did not leave with her brother because she wants to stand with Sigurd until the very end. A layer of tragedy and doom hangs in the air of this chapter. As Sigurd enters the desert, Quan and Ethelyn try to ride to his aid with Leonster's knights, but unfortunately, the king of Thracia, a man named Travant, ambushes and slays them in the desert. For some reason, Ethelyn brought along their oldest daughter, a girl named Altena, and Travant kidnaps her and steals the lance of Leonster's house, the Gay Bull. Sigurd finds out about this massacre after conquering Fëanora Castle and is forced to carry this grief into the final stages of the battle. But given how powerful Sigurd is, nobody can stop him. Lubeck and Fëanora Castle fall, and Sigurd marches on Valhalla. Just as they get in range to strike at the capital, Arvis unexpectedly betrays Duke Reptor in the middle of the battle. Once Reptor is dead, Sigurd consults with one of Arvis's top mages, a woman named Ida, to figure out what's going on. Apparently, Arvis always knew that Sigurd was innocent, but because Reptor and Lombard were too powerful and to avoid being branded as a traitor himself, he pretended to align with them, and once Sigurd had defeated them, he could join Sigurd to help clear his name. Thankfully, all is well that ends well, as House Velthimir's mages prepare a welcoming ceremony for Sigurd's crew to Valhalla, who are all fortunately innocent. I guess Claude's prediction was wrong. Thank goodness. Just kidding, turns out he was right after all. In a conversation, Arvis declares that Sigurd is still a traitor to the crown and must be executed. He reveals that his wife is Deirdre, and Sigurd is furious. He basically just does it to be a jerk, and Sigurd tries to tell Deirdre the truth, but Arvis has her dragged back to the castle by the guards before he can do so. Sigurd and his army are surrounded by the mages of Velthamir, who proceed to rain down on them an entire force of meteor spells. Arvis personally executes Sigurd with his powerful Valaflame tome, and Sigurd is now dead. So are Reptor and Lombard. With no one else in his way, and most of the continent under his thumb, Arvis declares himself the Emperor of Granavale. Before we move on to the rest of the game, we're treated to an ending narration that shows all of our units, both those who died and those whose fates remain unknown. The last bit really sums up the grim hand that fate dealt them. These brave youths fought to change the world for the better, but now their unfulfilled dreams lie dead with them upon the battlefield. Was their sacrifice in vain? What were they even fighting for? And what of the light? Our heroes have failed, and the villains have won. We pick up 17 years later in the country of Izok. We learn that despite conquering the continent, most of the people of Jugdral really didn't mind Arvis's rule, as he turned out to be a pretty good emperor of the continent. However, 7 years ago that all began to change, and the whole continent is now suffering under the oppressive nature of Arvis's new regime, which is starting to become more and more like the Dark Empire of Loptir from ages past. Where once we followed Sigurd, we now follow his son, Sealith, grown and ready to take the hero's position himself. He and some of the other children have been in hiding in Izok, but the Empire discovers where they are, and they're forced to the battlefield as they prepare to retake the country. The majority of the units in this half of the game are the children of the first generation. Each woman of the first generation had 2 children, 1 boy and 1 girl. What are the odds of that? Anyway, I'll explain each of them as we go, but we start with Sealith, of course, as well as Lana and Lester, who are the children of Edain, Diarmid, who is Lachesis' son, as well as Larse and Skaha, the twin children of Ira. Also joining the fray is Sigurd's grown-up squire, Oifi, who I mentioned earlier. We also get access to Fee, who is Aranis' daughter in this chapter, and Arthur, who is Tailtew's son. One more unit we get is Julia, but nobody really knows who she is, at least not yet. She's introduced to us by Elwyn, the only Generation 1 parent who actually makes an appearance in this half of the game. He doesn't fight anymore though, so we don't get to keep him. You can also pick one of 2 characters during this chapter. The acting king of Izok has 2 different sons, and you can choose either one of them when they speak with Larse, as both of them are in love with her. It really doesn't matter which one you speak to, but yeah, whichever one you speak to first will become your ally, and the other will become your enemy. And so with that, our heroes successfully mount a counterattack against Izok and retake the country. Before we continue with the story, however, I do have a few things to go over. First things first, how does the child's inheritance work? Well, in almost all cases, children will inherit the skills and items from their same-gender parent. However, this is reversed with Brigid, who gives Yufel to her son instead of her daughter. You may also be wondering, what if a female unit died in Generation 1 or didn't get married? Am I screwed out of getting their kids? Well, yes, but also not really. The game has a failsafe for people who didn't pair them up. For every woman in the first generation that did not marry, there are 2 replacement characters who act as stand-ins. They have different names, appearances, and personalities, but they have the same class types as the children they're replacing and function in the same roles. The obvious disadvantage of this is that none of them will have special skills or items from their parents, and they're generally less desirable than the actual children. You can do a second generation with any of the replacements and with none of the children, but they'll just be a little bit inferior overall. It's just recommended that you get all of the children and set them up as you like. While in-game it is impossible to have the counterparts and the children to exist alongside each other, there are two cases where it may actually be true. The replacement for Lacus's kids are known as Tristan and Jean, and they're actually the children of one of Lacus's knights that appeared in Chapter 2, a man named Eve. Similarly, the replacements for Tailteew's kids, who are named Amid and Linda, are actually the children of a woman named Ethnia. Who is she? Well, she is the younger sister of Tailteew and Bloom, making Arthur and Tine their potential cousins. Again, the children and the replacements can't coexist, but it's interesting to think about that these two sets of replacements have some lore to them and could potentially exist alongside the others who don't really have any connections. Maybe more exist, but these are the only ones that we know for sure. Another thing to go over is the fate of the members of Sigurd's army, as it was left a little unclear at the end of the first generation. Now, Sigurd, Quan, and Ethelyn all died, but it's also implied that all of the men did except for Elwyn. He survived, but he's acting very differently, and there is an explanation for it, but it won't be gone over until the finale. It's implied that all of the women survived, except for Ira. It seems that she died on the battlefield and never came home. So, other than that, what happened to the other mothers? Well, Aranis lived, and she lived for quite a while, but she died of an illness a couple years before the second generation began. Tailteew lived, but she had a really unfortunate fate. She was captured by her brother Bloom and his wife Hilda, and so was her daughter Tine. She was essentially constantly abused and eventually gave in to her despair and depression and died. Yeah, really unfortunate for her. Well, for the others, while Lachesis did live for a while, she vanished while in the middle of the desert and her fate remains unknown, as does the fate of Sylvia, who vanished after dropping her kids off at an orphanage. The two who lived, however, are the noble women of Ljungby. Edain is a priestess in Izok and is the one who actually raised most of the children that we start off with. Why she's not fighting alongside us as a priestess now, I guess we'll never know. Bridget also survived, but we don't actually see her in this game. We see her in Thracia 776, where she lost her memories and it was living out an alternate identity for several years. It's implied that after the end of the game, she eventually did regain her memories and reunited with her children, but again, that's not something that we see in this game. Anyway, we continue into Chapter 7, which involves crossing the desert to help out House Leonster, who are under attack from King Bloom. There we meet Nana, who is Diarmid's sister and Lachesis' daughter, Leith, who is Quan and Ethelyn's son, and Finn, who is still around and kicking from the first generation, the only Gen 1 unit to also join in Gen 2. We also get to meet up with Tine, who is Arthur's sister, reunite with Shanann, who is all grown and ready to fight, and we also meet Patty, who is Bridget's daughter, and Lean, who is Sylvia's. Our other unit is Ares, who is the son of Eldigan. An astute player can actually learn about him in the first generation by going to certain villages where we hear about Eldigan's son. So while crossing the desert, our heroes dismantle a Lopterian base and then move to liberate the city of Donna, the place where the miracle of old with the 12 Crusaders happened. They then continue on to Melgen Castle, where they have to face off against the Bloom's son, as well as Arthur and Tine's cousin, Ishtor. He and his girlfriend Lisa are defending it, and unlike his parents, Ishtor is described to be a good man by the other villagers. But unfortunately, we're forced to kill him and Lisa, something that Sealith struggles to accept. After doing that, though, we go off to Ulster to kick Bloom out, and he retreats before we can get the better of him. The following two chapters are sort of part of the same story. In Chapter 8, you get Fibail, who is Bridget's son, and Ced, who is Aranis's. Bloom from the last chapter is not happy and he's hoping to strike back, but unfortunately he's fighting against the protagonist and of course loses. We also have our first meeting with Ishtor's sister, a woman named Ishtar in this chapter, who also happens to be the girlfriend of the Prince of Granafale, a boy named Julius. Like her brother, Ishtar is described to be a good person, but unfortunately her loyalties lie with our enemies and we're forced to fight her. Julius comes and rescues her before she's seriously injured, but he leaves Bloom to die, and we end the chapter preparing to retake Thracia. Chapter 9 involves the conquest of Thracia. While Travant did seem pretty evil in Part 1, we finally learn his backstory. The whole reason why he and his kingdom kept trying to invade the Munster district is that the southern country of Thracia was pretty mountainous and not good for growing food, and they often needed more supplies, which the Munster district refused to give them. Leif doesn't really seem aware of this in the game, but it is something he learned in Thracia 776, vowing not to repeat his father's mistakes. During this chapter, Leaf is able to find Altena and tells her that they're siblings. She struggles to accept the truth and returns to Thracia, where Trevant confirms that she is indeed the daughter of Cly and Ethelyn, and that he killed them. He's prepared to kill her, but Arion, his son and Altena's adopted brother, steps in to do it himself. Fortunately, Arion was on her side and only knocked her out. After leaving Thracia in his son's hands, Trevant meets his doom on the battlefield at the hands of Sealif's army. Also in this chapter, we can meet and rescue Corpray, who is Sylvia's son, and also recruit Hannibal, a Thracian general who was raising him. Arion is retrieved by Julius at the last second before he dies, where he tells Arion that he will live to fight another day. With Thracia now freed, we move on to Chapter 10, where we begin Sealif's march on Granavel through the Miletos district. In this chapter, Julia actually gets kidnapped by Manfroy, and we finally learn who she really is, the younger twin to Julius and the Princess of Granavel, which makes both Julius and Julia Sealif's younger siblings. We also face off with Julius for the first time and Ishtar for the second, though both of them will leave when either one is defeated. This is also the chapter where we finally get to see the kind of person Julius is. It seems that he is the one behind the Empire's new cruel regime, and his father is little more than a puppet dancing at the end of his strings. Speaking of, Arvis is actually the final boss of this chapter. In this chapter, we kind of see a new side of him. Because yes, he did do evil things, but he always opposed the child hunts and the dark deeds that the Loptirian Church at the hands of Manfroy tried to push. However, Julius began usurping his power, and now he basically has none of his own. When Julia's memories are restored to her, she and Arvis have an emotional scene. Arvis frees several children he doesn't want sacrificed to the Dark God, and tries to free her, but Manfroy shows up and takes her, warning Arvis that if he doesn't fight against Sealif's army, then her life will be forfeit. Julia says in no uncertain terms that she knows her father is a good man, but Arvis denies it, realizing that he had always been Manfroy's puppet from the very beginning, and he regrets the actions he took. A missable event in this game is one that occurs if Sealif is the one to kill Arvis. If you have him then wait by a water tile, he will see the ghosts of his parents, who both show how proud they are of him. Yet his father's ghost warns him that there is still something he needs to remember. If he is unable to learn the struggles of the common man, then all of this fighting he's been doing to free the world will have been for naught. And with that, Sealif prepares to march on Granavel as his father once did. Before we get to the finale, I want to discuss the character of Arvis. He's a very morally gray character who did good and evil things. You know, he killed Sigurd and his army for basically no reason. I mean, they didn't do anything wrong. But, you know, his intentions with Manfroy weren't exactly wicked. He saw corruption and wanted to fix it. He knew that people were killed for just being suspected of being of Loptirian blood, and he didn't want them to be oppressed. However, he did tell Manfroy that he had no desire to let the Loptirian Church do as they did in the ages past, and would stop him if he attempted it. People liked Arvis for a reason, and he ruled the Empire of Granavel fairly well for the first 10 years for a reason. And while he did do things like, you know, show off Deirdre to Sigurd basically just to be mean, he had suspected that Sigurd's wife was Deirdre, but he couldn't help himself when he fell in love with her. Years later, he actually found out that Deirdre was his half-sister, and it horrified him as he finally realized what Manfroy's plan had been all along. He made sure never to tell this to Deirdre because he feared that the information would break her. It's also implied that Deirdre did eventually regain her memories of Sigurd, though she could not hate Arvis as he had been good to her just as Sigurd had been. Unfortunately, however, Deirdre never survived into the second generation. How do we know she didn't survive? Well, we find out here in the finale. When they were younger, Manfroy placed the Book of Loptir into Julius's hands, and while Julia recalls that her brother had been kind and wise up to that point, the Book of Loptir immediately possessed Julius and he became evil, a vessel for the Dark God. Fortunately, Deirdre was able to save Julia's life by teleporting her to safety, but Julius struck her down, and Julius began usurping his father's power, warping the Empire of Granavel into something much more like the Empire of Loptir of old, and they began to commit all the same old atrocities, child hunts, and massacres of their citizens for no reason. But no matter what Julius and Granavel throw at him, nothing is a match for Sealif's Liberation Army as they slowly march on Valhalla. After liberating House Frege, we learn that the children they've been trying to rescue were hidden there by Ishtar, as Ishtar was always against the child hunts and quietly worked with Arvis against Julius to save the children as much as she could. could. At this point, Ishtar comes to face down the army. You may be wondering why, especially given she was trying to help save the children. Well, she did meet Julius before he was possessed by Loptir and fell in love with him, and she's been unable to shake her feelings for him even after he changed. So while she should be fighting on our side, she ultimately refuses to turn even with Tina's pleas and refuses to back down, and she ultimately perishes upon the battlefield. Though not canon, Fire Emblem Heroes explores her character a little bit more and the conflict within her heart. It even has a version of her that realized her beloved Julius was truly beyond saving, and she had to strike down the Dark God who was puppeteering his body. Meanwhile, in the main chapter, Julia gets temporarily brainwashed by Manfroy, though after he is slain, she rejoins the party. She retrieves the Book of Naga, the only weapon able to counter Loptir, and joins them to take down her brother Julius, which she finally does, ending the Holy War. With Julius now dead, Sealith becomes the new king of Granavale, seeking to restore peace across the world. All the children who live get to take over the territories of their parents, and if Oifi is alive, he takes over Chalfi. The Holy War is over, peace is restored, and the dark blood of Loptir is gone. The finale also confirms what you might have guessed earlier. Elwyn did indeed die in the Battle of Valhalla, however the dragon Forseti decided to resurrect him and interfere with the events going on in Jugdral. He made sure Sealith would succeed, though we do wonder why he was the only one to do this. We never really find out Forseti's motives, so it's just something that we're left to wonder about. So, as the credits roll, I do want to give my final thoughts on the game. Fire Emblem 4 was a very unique entry to the series, both in terms of its story and its gameplay. It added many things like a second generation and the weapon triangle, class skills, personal skills, so much that is dear to the identity of this franchise. Without this game, Fire Emblem would not be the series it is today. Yet at the same time, there's a bunch of things that exist only in this game. The huge maps, the set arena opponents, home bases to guard, the absurdly long chapters which take hours to clear. The developers clearly saw its flaws, and there's a reason we haven't gotten a game like it ever again. It's very unfriendly to newcomers who may struggle to grasp some important mechanics and miss events that would help them a lot. I didn't even mention earlier the confusing way that Lex can get a Brave Axe or Arden can get a Pursuit Ring. It's a very complicated game, and while it does have many flaws, I do still appreciate most of what it did. As of the writing of this video, there have been no announcements regarding a remake of this game. There have been rumors circulating in the community for years, but nothing confirmed. If this game ever gets remade, I want it to expand on the story, and I want it to more closely align with the rest of the series. Some people have said that that would take away the charm of this game, but I do think it would provide an overall better experience. But whatever the future may hold for Fire Emblem, I do look forward to it. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, we'll get this game remade, or maybe we'll get a game as strange and unique as Fire Emblem Genealogy of the